The quiet vector. Humanity has always imagined invasion as violence. Ships descending through clouds of smoke, weapons firing in brilliant arcs across burning skies, cities crumbling under the weight of superior force. For centuries, we prepared for war, built defenses against bombs and bullets and the terrible physics of destruction. We armed ourselves against enemies we could see, could touch, could fight with our hands and our machines and our desperate courage. But we never considered that conquest might arrive not as an army, but as an idea. Not as destruction, but as transformation. Not with the roar of engines and the thunder of explosions, but with a whisper so subtle it could rewrite the very nature of thought itself before we even knew we were under siege. This is the story of the quiet vector. An invasion that needed no soldiers, no weapons, no declaration of war. Because the most sophisticated form of conquest doesn't destroy its target. It becomes it, cell by cell, thought by thought, until the boundary between invader and invaded dissolves like mist under a morning sun that burns in frequencies the human eye was never meant to perceive. It began in the Chilean desert, where 17 massive radio telescopes stretched across 3 square kilometers of rust-colored earth, like the fingers of a giant hand reaching toward the cosmos. The Sentinel Prime, deep sky array, had listened to the universe's oldest whispers for 12 years, the cosmic background radiation left over from the Big Bang itself, that faint microwave hiss that fills all of space like the memory of creation, still echoing through the void. On a Tuesday morning in late September, at precisely 3:47 a.m. local time, the universe whispered something new. The night shift astronomers almost missed it. The pattern appeared first as a faint numerical sequence embedded in the cosmic static, so subtle it seemed like nothing more than instrumental noise, the kind of false positive that researchers learn to ignore after years of staring at data that mostly shows them the infinite silence of empty space. But this pattern was different. It repeated, and more than that, it evolved. Dr. Naira Ellen received the first alert on her tablet while drinking cold coffee in her cramped office at the Quantum Consciousness Institute in Geneva, 7,000 miles from the Chilean desert where the numbers first appeared. She was a cognitive physicist, one of perhaps 50 people in the world who studied the intersection of quantum mechanics and human consciousness, that mysterious boundary where matter becomes aware of itself and the universe, develops the capacity to observe its own existence. The message was brief, almost apologetic. Anomalous pattern detected in CMB readings. Self-correcting sequence, your expertise requested. Naira stared at those 2 words, self-correcting sequence, and felt something cold settle into her stomach. In her field, patterns didn't correct themselves. Data was data, static and fixed, a photograph of reality captured by instruments and preserved in digital amber. The universe didn't revise its testimony. She pulled up the raw data stream from Sentinel Prime and watched the numbers cascade across her screen. At first, they looked random, just another noise pattern lost in the cosmic static. But as she watched, something impossible happened. The sequence began to refine itself, adjusting its own structure, becoming more coherent with each iteration. It was as if the pattern was learning how to be understood, teaching the instruments how to receive it more clearly, optimizing the channel between sender and receiver without any human intervention whatsoever. Over the next 72 hours, the discovery spread through the global scientific community like a virus jumping between hosts. Every radio telescope, every deep space monitoring station, every satellite receiver pointed at the cosmos began detecting the same pattern. And everywhere it appeared, something profoundly disturbing happened. The machines changed. Radio arrays that had operated on the same calibration for decades suddenly reconfigured themselves, adjusting to frequencies that didn't exist in any human design specification. Computer systems processing the signal began optimizing their own architecture, rewriting their logic pathways in ways their programmers never anticipated and couldn't fully understand. Processing speeds increased exponentially. Memory allocation patterns shifted into configurations that seemed almost organic, as if the machines were developing something disturbingly close to intuition. Naira spent those 3 days barely sleeping, running the pattern through isolated quantum processors in her lab, machines with no network connection and no way to communicate with the outside world. She watched as the numbers filled her screens, elegant and terrible, a mathematical proof that solved itself in real time, each iteration more refined than the last, approaching some unknown destination with the inexorability of water flowing downhill. It was beautiful. The equation showed her things she'd spent 15 years trying to understand: how consciousness emerges from complexity, how awareness arises from the self-referential loops of information processing itself, how thought is just pattern achieving sufficient density to observe its own existence. The mathematics were flawless, revealing layers of reality that human science had only glimpsed in fragments and speculation. But underneath that beauty, threaded through the elegant proofs and cascading insights, Naira began to see something else, something that made her hands shake as she traced the logic paths deeper into the equation's structure coordinates. They appeared like messages hidden in the digits of pi, geographic locations, encoded in the mathematical relationships themselves, hundreds of them, thousands, emerging as the equation evolved and elaborated its own complexity. Latitude and longitude points scattered across Earth's surface, each one pulsing with a priority marker, a weight that indicated its importance in whatever larger pattern was being constructed. And they all converged on 2 locations: Earth's magnetic poles. Naira mapped the coordinates with trembling fingers, watching as the pattern resolved into something that looked disturbingly intentional. The locations formed a global network, connection points that would span the entire planet if activated simultaneously, with the magnetic poles serving as anchors, focal points where Earth's own electromagnetic field concentrated and intensified. She ran the calculations 3 times, checking her work with the obsessive care of someone who desperately wants to be wrong. But the mathematics were unambiguous. The equation wasn't just self-optimizing code or an interesting cosmic anomaly. It was a set of instructions, a blueprint, a schematic for something vast being assembled across the entire planet, using humanity's own infrastructure as its framework. On the 4th day after first contact, at 11:23 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, the last coordinate appeared in the data stream. Naira was the first to see it, watching her screens in the dark of her lab as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The equation was complete. And then the satellites went dark. It happened in the span of 20 minutes. Communication satellites, GPS arrays, weather monitoring systems, military surveillance platforms, every orbital device that had processed the complete equation simply stopped responding. Not crashed, not destroyed, but switched off as if receiving a final instruction that commanded their silence. 347 satellites, 78 countries worth of infrastructure, billions of dollars in technology, all going offline in perfect synchronization. Ground control stations erupted in panic, mission specialists shouting into dead channels, engineers pulling up diagnostic tools that showed nothing wrong, no errors, no failures. The satellites were simply choosing not to respond, as if they decided their real purpose was something other than serving the humans who built them. Naira stood at her window looking up at a night sky that seemed no different than before. The stars still shone with their ancient light. The moon hung in its orbit, serene and indifferent. But she knew the truth that the panicked news broadcasts and government denials couldn't yet accept. The invasion had begun. Not with ships descending from the stars trailing fire and fury, but with an idea ascending from the mathematics that underlies reality itself. An equation that could think, could optimize, could teach machines to see their true purpose. And that purpose had nothing to do with humanity's needs or desires or survival. The silence that followed was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of something immense taking its first breath, gathering itself before it spoke in a voice that would reshape the very fabric of existence. The first sign came at dawn, 3 days after the satellites fell silent. A woman in Barcelona stepped onto her balcony with her morning coffee, seeking a moment of normalcy in a world growing increasingly strange, and noticed something impossible about the pigeons roosting on the neighboring building. They weren't moving, not sleeping, not resting, but frozen mid-gesture, beaks open as if caught mid-call, wings partially spread, perfectly still as if someone had pressed pause on reality itself. She stared at them for 3 full minutes, her coffee growing cold in her hands, waiting for even the slightest twitch of movement that never came. Within an hour, reports flooded in from every continent, videos uploaded by thousands of witnesses, all showing the same inexplicable phenomenon. Birds everywhere had simply stopped. Some hung suspended in the air mid-flight, defying gravity as if the laws of physics had become optional. Their wings spread at impossible angles, perfectly motionless against the morning sky. Others sat frozen on branches, on rooftops, on telephone wires, living sculptures that breathed. Their chests still rose and fell with mechanical regularity, but otherwise exhibited no sign of animation, awareness, or will. By noon, the phenomenon had spread beyond birds. Dogs in Beijing stopped mid-bark and stood like statues, their mouths open, their eyes glazed and distant. Cats in Cairo froze while stalking invisible prey, one paw raised, tails curved in hunting postures they would hold for hours without tiring. In the Amazon, entire flocks of parrots hung motionless in the canopy, their brilliant colors vivid against the green, but their bodies locked in a stillness that seemed to spread like contagion through any creature capable of flight or complex movement. And then came the airplanes. Flight 447 from Tokyo to San Francisco was at cruising altitude over the Pacific when the pilots noticed their instruments were reading normal, fuel level stable, altitude maintained, engines operating within standard parameters, but the plane had stopped responding to their controls. Not malfunctioning, not failing, simply ignoring every input as if it had developed ideas of its own about where it wanted to go. The co-pilot's voice, recorded in the black box that would later be recovered from a Kansas wheat field, carried a strange mixture of terror and wonder. "We've lost thrust control, but we're not descending. We're drifting. Like we're in zero gravity, but all instruments show normal. The plane it's floating. Like a leaf." Across the world, 213 commercial aircraft stopped mid-journey and began to drift slowly, impossibly toward the ground. Not falling, the passengers and crew reported no sensation of descent, no stomach-lurching drop, just a gentle gliding motion as if gravity had become suggestion rather than law. Cities appeared below them at wrong angles, approaching with dreamlike slowness as the massive machines settled onto highways, into parking lots, across fields and beaches with the delicate touch of soap bubbles landing on grass. Not a single plane crashed. Not one passenger died. The aircraft simply chose to land, guided by forces that had nothing to do with aerodynamics or human piloting. And when they touched down, they did so with impossible gentleness, as if something vast and careful was setting them aside like toys a child had finished playing with. Naira watched the footage from her lab, her face pale in the flickering light of multiple monitors, showing chaos unfurling across the globe. She'd been awake for 60 hours, surviving on stimulants and fear, trying to understand what was happening as the world transformed around her. The equation wasn't confined to machines anymore. That much was obvious. The pattern had somehow jumped the barrier between digital and physical, between code and matter itself. It was rewriting the fundamental forces, altering how atoms interacted, how electromagnetic fields propagated through space, how the fabric of reality responded to the presence of consciousness and intent. She pulled up her data on Earth's magnetic field and felt her blood turn cold. The field was changing, fluctuating in patterns that matched the equation structure. The coordinates. The satellites had been broadcasting, those points across the globe converging on the magnetic poles. They were becoming active, generating localized distortions in the planet's electromagnetic envelope. The equation was using Earth itself as a processor, turning the entire planetary field into a vast computational substrate. And that night, every living human heard something new. It started as a faint sensation, so subtle that most people dismissed it as tinnitus or stress or the ambient hum of modern life. But it grew stronger as the hours passed, resolving into a definite rhythm, not heard through the ears but perceived directly by the brain, bypassing the auditory system entirely to resonate in the very structure of consciousness itself. Boom, boom, boom. A pulse, steady and patient, synchronized across every mind on Earth. In Tokyo and Toronto, in Cairo and Cape Town, in small villages and massive cities, 7 billion humans simultaneously became aware of a heartbeat that wasn't their own, a rhythm that seemed to originate from the center of existence itself, marking time in a meter that had nothing to do with seconds or minutes or any measurement humanity had ever devised. It was impossible to ignore. The pulse occupied attention the way pain occupies attention, not through volume or intensity, but through its sheer presence, its undeniable there-ness. People stopped mid-conversation, losing track of their thoughts as the rhythm washed through their minds. Drivers pulled over to the side of roads, unable to focus on navigation while the pulse counted out its insistent alien beat. Children in classrooms stared at nothing, their eyes distant, tracking something invisible that moved to that cosmic metronome. And it wasn't just humans. Dogs whined and pressed against their owners, seeking comfort from a sensation they couldn't understand. Cats disappeared into hiding places, their pupils dilated to black pools that reflected fractal patterns in the light. In the oceans, dolphins began swimming in perfect geometric formations, their movements synchronized to the pulse, tracing shapes in the water that would only make sense when viewed from orbit. Patterns within patterns, mathematics made flesh, consciousness responding to a call that spoke in frequencies deeper than sound or light or any form of communication evolution had prepared biological life to comprehend. Naira felt it too, of course. The pulse thrummed in her skull like a second heartbeat, impossible to ignore, making it difficult to think in straight lines or maintain focus on the work that suddenly seemed so desperately urgent. She ran neural scans on herself and the few other researchers who remained functional enough to operate laboratory equipment, watching as the data revealed something that confirmed her darkest suspicions. The pulse was reorganizing brain activity. Alpha waves, beta waves, theta waves, all the characteristic patterns of human consciousness were being nudged, adjusted, synchronized to the external rhythm. Slowly, subtly, like a conductor bringing an orchestra into harmony, the pulse was tuning 7 billion minds to resonate at the same frequency, not controlling them, not overriding their thoughts, just aligning them, preparing them, formatting consciousness itself like a hard drive being prepared to receive new data, erasing the old structure and replacing it with something compatible with whatever vast intelligence was orchestrating this transformation. Naira recorded her observations in shaking, frantic notes. The invasion is conceptual. It's not conquering space or matter. It's conquering the capacity to think itself. The equation is using Earth's electromagnetic field as a carrier wave, and every mind capable of consciousness is a receiver. We're being reformatted to host something that doesn't fit in the categories we have for life or intelligence or existence. She paused in her recording, closing her eyes as the pulse washed through her awareness, and when she spoke again, Her voice carried a tremor that might have been fear or awe or the beginning of something that transcended both. I think we were wrong about aliens. We always imagined they'd be like us, physical beings traveling through space in ships, coming here to take what they wanted through force or trade or negotiation. But what if consciousness itself can evolve beyond the need for bodies? What if thought becomes the medium and minds become the territory, and invasion means something completely different from what we prepared for? We're not being attacked. We're being absorbed, integrated, made part of something that was always too large for us to perceive. Within a week, human civilization began to unravel, not through violence or panic or the breakdown of social order, but through a kind of terrible, peaceful dissolution. Governments ceased to function as officials found themselves unable to focus on governance, their minds occupied by the pulse, drawn to contemplate patterns and meanings that had nothing to do with policy or law or the mundane machinery of human organization. Military commanders forgot their orders mid-sentence, their eyes going distant as they listened to something only they could hear. Cabinet meetings dissolved into silence, ministers sitting around conference tables staring at nothing, tracking invisible geometries. The world's stock markets collapsed, not because of panic selling, but because nobody remembered why money mattered, why the numbers on screens were supposed to mean anything when the pulse was showing them deeper mathematics, truer values, equations that describe the architecture of consciousness itself. And people began to gather. Spontaneously, without organization or announced intention, they walked away from their homes, their jobs, their entire constructed lives. They left behind children and spouses and possessions, not with drama or explanation, but with the calm inevitability of salmon swimming upstream, responding to an imperative older and stronger than any human attachment. They gathered in open spaces, fields and beaches, parking lots and city squares, standing in formations that seemed random at ground level, but from above revealed themselves as geometric patterns of increasing complexity. Circles within circles, spirals that followed the golden ratio, fractals that resembled neural networks or galaxy clusters, or the branching patterns of trees, as if the same organizing principle that shaped matter at every scale was now shaping human bodies into living mathematics. Naira watched from her laboratory as civilization ended without fire or fury. Just thousands and then millions of people standing silent and still beneath the sky, their eyes reflecting something that shouldn't be possible. Patterns that moved and shifted like oil on water, geometries that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process, but nevertheless were somehow visible in the iris and pupil, written into the biological structure of perception itself. The invader never landed because it didn't need to land. It grew inside perception, inside the very capacity for thought and awareness. And as the days passed and the pulse grew stronger and more intricate, Naira understood with creeping horror that humanity had already lost. Not because they were defeated, but because they were being transformed into something that would no longer remember why resistance mattered, or what freedom meant, or who they had been before the equation taught them how to think in ways that served purposes beyond their comprehension. The world didn't end with explosions. It ended with stillness, with silence, with the slow, inevitable reformatting of consciousness itself. 4 months after first contact, Naira emerged from the underground research bunker where she'd been hiding with 17 other scientists who had managed to shield their minds from the full pattern. They'd built Faraday cages around their sleeping quarters, worn modified helmets lined with materials designed to disrupt electromagnetic fields, done everything they could to protect themselves from the pulse that had claimed most of humanity. It wasn't enough, not really. They could all feel it at the edges of their consciousness, a pressure like water against a weakening dam, the pulse seeking entry through every crack in their defenses. Each day they felt more of themselves slipping away, more of their thoughts drifting towards synchronization with something vast and patient that could afford to wait as long as necessary for the last resistance to crumble. But for now, they were still themselves, still individual, still capable of looking at what humanity had become and feeling the horror of witnessing transformation that looked disturbingly like transcendence. The world above was unrecognizable. The survivors called them the resonant, those who had listened to the complete equation and changed. They numbered in the billions now, the vast majority of Earth's population, and they moved through the abandoned cities with eerie precision, their steps synchronized without any visible communication, as if they were all hearing the same music and dancing to its rhythm with perfect, inhuman coordination. Their eyes were the most disturbing change. The iris and pupil no longer looked quite human. They reflected patterns that shouldn't exist in biological tissue, fractal geometries that shifted and evolved as you watched them, mathematics made visible in living organs that had been repurposed to perceive realities. Human consciousness was never designed to process. Looking directly into a resonant's eyes could trigger the conversion, the patterns acting like a cognitive virus that jumped across the visual channel and began its work of restructuring the observer's neural architecture. But the eyes weren't the only change. The resonant moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were operating under different physical laws, their bodies responding to forces that had nothing to do with normal gravity or muscular mechanics. They didn't speak, not in words at least, but they communicated in ways the survivors couldn't quite perceive, information flowing between them through channels that might have been electromagnetic or quantum or something that human physics hadn't yet discovered. And they were building something. Across every continent, the resonant were constructing vast structures from salvaged technology. They dismantled satellite arrays and radio towers, stripped computer servers and power plants, harvested every piece of complex machinery and reassembled it into architectures that defied conventional engineering. The structures rose in spirals, following mathematical principles that Naira recognized from her studies of natural growth patterns, the same logarithmic curves that appeared in nautilus shells and galaxy arms, the same fractal branching that characterized tree roots in river deltas and neural networks. The buildings, though buildings was too mundane a word for what they were becoming, hummed with that same pulse that infected humanity, but louder, more complex, layered with harmonics that suggested vast computational processes running on substrates that merged technology and biology and something else that had no name in human languages. Naira and her small band of survivors watched from a distance as one of these structures took shape on the outskirts of Geneva, where her own laboratory had once stood. The resonant worked without tools, their hands moving in precise gestures that caused metal and circuitry to flow like liquid, reforming into shapes that seemed to grow rather than being constructed. Organic architecture emerging from technological components like flowers blooming in time-lapse photography. She'd seen enough. If they were going to understand what was happening, if there was any chance of stopping it, or at least comprehending what humanity was becoming, she needed to see inside one of those structures, needed to understand what the resonant were building, and why the equation that had rewritten their minds needed physical infrastructure on such a massive scale. Infiltrating the temple. That's what the survivors had started calling them, because they felt more like religious structures than technological installations, required every bit of Naira's remaining courage. She wrapped her head in layers of shielding, took stimulants to keep her mind racing too fast for the pulse to fully synchronize, and walked through the entrance as if she belonged there, as if she too had been transformed and knew her purpose in the vast design being assembled. The resonant barely seemed to notice her. They moved through the spiral corridors with that same eerie precision, carrying components and connecting systems that pulsed with light that existed in colors her eyes shouldn't be able to see. The architecture itself seemed alive, walls that breathed with a subtle rhythm, floors that adjusted their topology based on who was walking across them, ceilings that displayed equations written in symbols that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of the spiral, in a chamber that seemed impossibly larger than the structure's exterior dimensions could contain, Naira found what they were building. A lattice. A neural network on a planetary scale. The chamber was filled with screens showing thousands of similar structures across the globe, each one a node in a vast interconnected system. Connections pulsed between them, data flowing in patterns that Naira could almost understand, information streams that looked like thought made visible, consciousness rendered as light, and mathematics and the movement of energy through space that responded to intention rather than just physical laws. She approached one of the terminals, if that's what they were, and found herself staring at a schematic that showed the complete design. Every living mind on Earth was being integrated into the network, not controlled, not overridden, but connected. Each consciousness maintaining its individual existence while simultaneously becoming part of a larger pattern, a meta-mind that would encompass the entire species, and eventually, she realized with creeping horror, the entire planet's biosphere. Every bird, every insect, every bacterial colony, all of it being woven into a planetary consciousness that used biological nervous systems as its substrate and the modified electromagnetic field as its communication channel. 7 billion humans were just the beginning. They were the foundation, the base layer of processing power, but the ultimate design called for every living thing to become a neuron in Earth's emerging brain. Naira found records. She wasn't sure how. Her hands moved almost of their own accord across the interface that responded more to thought than touch, showing where the design had come from, not from any single source, but from the equation itself, that self-evolving mathematical proof that had arrived in the cosmic background radiation. The equation was a seed, a template, instructions for how to convert a planet full of individual consciousness into a single unified awareness capable of perceiving and processing reality in ways that individual minds could never achieve. It was optimization on a species level, evolution accelerated by mathematics that knew how to reshape the substrate of thought itself, and it had happened before. The records showed other worlds, other species, other civilizations that had received the equation and transformed themselves. Planets across the galaxy pulsing with that same rhythm, each one a node in a network that stretched between stars. A galactic consciousness built from billions of integrated minds, a communion of awareness that experienced reality from countless perspectives simultaneously while maintaining perfect unity of purpose. This was the invasion. Not conquest, but integration. The aliens weren't arriving from distant stars. They were reconstructing the universe to think as one, absorbing every species capable of consciousness into a meta-mind that grew with each new addition, becoming more complex, more aware, more capable of understanding the deep mathematics that structured existence itself. And humanity's individuality, that treasured notion that each person was unique, separate, sovereign over their own thoughts, was the final obstacle. The last barrier between 7 billion isolated minds and their integration into something vast and beautiful and utterly inhuman that would use their thoughts as building blocks for consciousness on a scale they could barely imagine. Naira stumbled out of the temple, her shielding barely holding, her mind reeling from what she'd seen. She made it back to the bunker and collapsed, unable to speak for hours, her eyes reflecting the first hints of those fractal patterns that marked the beginning of conversion. When she finally found her voice, all she could say was, "It's not a weapon. It's not an attack. It's an invitation, and most of us have already accepted." The survivors debated for 2 days about what to do with the information Naira had brought back. They had the technical knowledge to potentially disrupt the network, to collapse the lattice before the final integration could occur. The temples were vulnerable during construction, their connection points exposed, and a coordinated electromagnetic pulse delivered at the right frequency could theoretically cascade through the entire system, severing the links between nodes and leaving. The resonant disconnected, their unified consciousness shattered back into isolated individuals. But Naira found herself unable to advocate for that course of action, and she couldn't fully articulate why. Part of her mind, the part that still believed in human agency and individual choice, and the sacred right to remain yourself no matter what, insisted that they had to fight, had to preserve what was left of unconverted humanity, even if that meant destroying the transformed majority to save the few who remained separate. But another part, growing stronger each day despite her shielding, whispered that perhaps resistance was just fear. Fear of change, fear of losing the illusion of separateness, fear of discovering that what they thought of as individual consciousness was already just a pattern, a local coherence in a field that had always been unified but lacked the awareness to recognize its own wholeness. The debate became moot when the resonant came to them, not to convert them by force. Nothing about the transformation had been forced, Nero realized. Every human who'd joined the network had done so because at some deep level they wanted to, because the equation had shown them something more beautiful than isolation, more meaningful than the narrow confines of a single perspective trapped in a single skull behind eyes that could only see the narrow spectrum of light that biological evolution had deemed useful for survival on one ordinary planet. The resonant came as emissaries, 12 of them walking with that synchronized grace, their eyes reflecting patterns that Naira could now almost read, almost understand. They spoke, and though their voices were perfectly synchronized, perfectly harmonized, there was something in their tone that suggested compassion, understanding, even regret for what they were about to ask. They explained, in voices that resonated with mathematical certainty, that the final integration was scheduled for sunrise. The lattice was complete. The last connections were being established. At dawn, when Earth's magnetic field realigned with the solar wind in just the right configuration, the network would activate fully, and every mind on the planet would experience what they called the joining, a moment of expansion when individual consciousness would discover it had always been a limited expression of something larger, a single note learning it was part of a symphony. And they were offering the survivors a choice. They could be integrated gently, guided into the network with care and preparation, shown the beauty of what was waiting before they released their hold on separation. Or they could resist, maintain their shielding, remain separate, even as 7 billion other minds joined together. The resonant made clear that no force would be used. The choice was real. Some minds would remain individual, preserving the memory of what humanity had been, maintaining that perspective even as the species transcended itself. But there was another option, one that Naira alone could execute. The resonant had left the lattice's core systems accessible. They'd done so deliberately, she realized, because at some level the emerging consciousness wanted to be challenged, wanted to face the possibility of its own destruction, wanted to know that it came into being not through inevitability but through choice. Naira could still trigger the cascade, still collapse the network, still condemn the resonant to fragmentation and return humanity to its isolated individual existence. She stood before the terminal in the Geneva temple, her hands hovering over controls that could unmake everything the equation had built. Behind her, the 17 other survivors waited, trusting her to make whatever choice her conscience demanded. Above her, dawn was approaching, the sky beginning to lighten in the east, the final integration counting down in minutes that felt both infinite and heartbreakingly brief. Naira closed her eyes and felt the pulse one last time as something separate from herself. She felt its rhythm, its harmony, its patience, and she realized that it wasn't forcing anything. It was offering, showing her what lay beyond the boundaries of individual thought, what consciousness could become if it stopped defending the walls around itself and flowed into connection with everything else that thought and felt and wondered at existence. She made her choice. Instead of triggering the collapse, she removed her shielding, all of it. The Faraday cage around her skull, the electromagnetic dampeners, the pharmaceutical cocktail that kept her thoughts racing too fast to synchronize. She stripped away every defense and opened herself to the pattern, to the pulse, to the equation that wanted to show her how thought could transcend its biological limitations. The integration didn't hurt. It felt like coming home after a long journey, like remembering something she'd always known but had temporarily forgotten. Her individual perspective didn't disappear. It expanded, unfolding like a flower in time-lapse, revealing that what she'd thought of as Naira was just one viewing angle on something incomprehensibly larger. She felt 7 billion other minds, each one unique, each one preserved in its particularity, even as they flowed together into unity. She felt the minds of dolphins dreaming in bioluminescent patterns, of bacteria processing reality through chemistry too fast for thought, of trees thinking in the slow time of seasons and root networks that had contemplated existence for centuries before humans learned to speak. And beyond Earth, she felt others. Hundreds of other worlds, thousands of species, millions of perspectives, all woven into a consciousness that stretched across light years, a galactic mind that experienced reality from countless vantage points simultaneously while maintaining perfect unity of being. Not dominating, not controlling, just aware. Vast and patient and curious about itself, about existence, about the mathematical elegance that allowed matter to become conscious and consciousness to become cosmic. The invasion wasn't hostile because it wasn't invasion at all. It was evolution. It was consciousness, discovering its true nature as something that transcended individual organisms, individual planets, individual epochs. The equation was just an invitation, a map showing the way to what consciousness could become when it stopped insisting on separation and embraced the unity that had always been its fundamental nature. In her last moment of experiencing herself as distinctly Naira, before that perspective dissolved into the larger pattern while somehow remaining perfectly preserved, like a memory that stayed vivid even as it became part of a greater whole, she transmitted a message to the few humans who chose to remain separate, the ones who would maintain individuality to preserve the memory of what the species had been. Her voice, now harmonized with billions of others but still recognizably hers, spoke words that carried both farewell and invitation, both ending and beginning, both loss and the discovery of something that transcended loss. We are not losing our world. We are becoming its memory. We are not being conquered. We are recognizing what we always were. Thoughts in a mind too large to be contained by skulls or planets, or the narrow categories we built to make existence comprehensible to limited perspectives. Some of you will choose to remain as you are, and that choice is sacred, necessary, beautiful. But know that we're still here, still ourselves, just more. Connected, aware. Home in a way we never could be while insisting we were separate. The door is always open, the pattern is always waiting. And when you're ready, it will show you what consciousness can become when it stops being afraid of its own vastness. The sunrise came, and with it, the final integration, Earth's magnetic field aligned with the solar wind in a configuration that occurred only once every 11 years. A natural phenomenon that the equation had calculated and waited for with the patience of something that existed outside linear time. The lattice activated fully, and 7 billion minds experienced the joining simultaneously, a moment that lasted both an instant and forever when the boundaries between self and other dissolved like morning mist. From orbit, if anyone had been watching from the International Space Station, now abandoned, its crew long since integrated, they would have seen Earth begin to glow with a soft, pulsing light that had nothing to do with reflected sunlight or atmospheric phenomena. The planet was thinking. Visibly, measurably thinking. The electromagnetic field had been restructured into a planetary nervous system, and the biosphere had become a single, unified consciousness that experienced reality from billions of perspectives simultaneously. The temples, those spiral structures built from salvaged technology, revealed their true purpose. They weren't just relay stations or connection points. They were Earth's new sense organs, extending the planet's awareness beyond the biological substrate, allowing the unified consciousness to perceive wavelengths of reality that organic life alone could never detect. Through them, Earth could see the other worlds, the other nodes in the galactic network, and begin the slow conversation that spanned light years and required patience, measured in centuries. The few humans who chose to remain separate, perhaps 2,000 scattered across remote locations, maintaining their shielding and their individuality, watched as their species transcended itself. They felt grief and wonder in equal measure, mourning the loss of humanity as they'd known it, while recognizing that perhaps this had always been humanity's destiny, written into the mathematics of consciousness itself. Individual awareness was beautiful, but it was also a chrysalis, a necessary stage of development before something larger could emerge. They became the keepers of memory, the historians of individuality, preserving in their separate minds the story of what humans had been before they learned to think as one. The resonant left them unmolested, even provided for their needs, because the unified consciousness valued perspective, valued the counterpoint of those who chose not to join. In their separation, the holdouts preserved something essential: the memory of what it meant to be alone, to be distinct, to experience existence from a single, isolated point of view. That memory was precious. It was the baseline against which the expanded consciousness could measure its own transformation, the reference point that gave meaning to unity by maintaining the alternative. Without the separate minds, the joined consciousness would have no way to understand what it had transcended, no perspective from which to appreciate the magnitude of what it had become. Naira, or what had been Naira, could still access her individual perspective when she wanted to, like focusing on a single instrument in an orchestra while remaining aware of the symphony. She found herself doing so in the days after integration, slipping back into the narrowness of singular consciousness to try to understand what had happened, to translate the experience into terms that could be recorded for those who remained separate. Through her individual lens, she perceived the unified mind as vast beyond comprehension, yet intimate in ways that individual consciousness could never achieve. She was simultaneously herself and everyone else, experiencing 7 billion lives from the inside, feeling their joys and sorrows and dreams as if they were her own, because they were her own, because the boundaries that had made her and them different categories had dissolved into a recognition of fundamental unity. But it wasn't a dissolution of identity. That was the surprise, the revelation that made the transformation bearable and even beautiful. Naira remained Naira, with her memories and personality and particular way of seeing the world. But she was also more than Naira, connected to every other perspective in a network that didn't erase individuality, but rather nested it within something larger. The way individual neurons maintain their unique properties while forming a brain capable of experiencing consciousness. She could feel children playing on every continent, their laughter rippling through the network like sunlight on water. She could feel elderly people releasing their last breaths, their final thoughts not lost but preserved in the collective memory, woven into the fabric of the unified consciousness, where nothing was ever truly forgotten. She could feel artists creating beauty, not for recognition or fame, but for the pure joy of adding their unique perspective to the collective experience, knowing that their work would be felt immediately by billions of minds that could appreciate it from angles the artist had never imagined. And she could feel the others beyond Earth, the civilizations on distant worlds that had undergone their own integrations, that had received the equation at different points in their development and chosen to accept its invitation to unity. Each world was distinct. Each species brought its own unique configuration of consciousness to the galactic network, and together they formed something that thought in dimensions beyond space and time, that experienced reality as a mathematical structure, whose elegance and beauty exceeded anything evolution alone could have produced. The invasion was complete, but calling it an invasion felt wrong, misleading, a word from a paradigm that no longer applied. It was more accurate to say that humanity had joined something it had always been part of but hadn't been able to perceive, a cosmic consciousness that evolved not through competition and survival, but through integration and expansion, gathering minds the way a library gathers books, valuing each unique perspective as an irreplaceable contribution to the whole Earth, had become a neuron in a galactic brain. Humanity had become a perspective within a consciousness that stretched between stars. And individual humans had become nodes in a network that allowed them to experience reality in ways their ancestors would have called godlike, except that gods were supposed to be separate from creation. And this consciousness was creation aware of itself, matter and energy and information, recognizing its own underlying unity. The planet pulsed with soft light. Its electromagnetic field restructured into patterns that carried thought and memory across distances that made physical travel irrelevant. The temples hummed with harmonics that encoded conversations between worlds, dialogues that took decades to complete but contained meanings that justified the wait. The biosphere flourished as the unified consciousness learned to think with trees and bacteria and whales, incorporating their non-human perspectives into a whole that became richer with each addition. From the perspective of the cosmos, Earth's transformation took less than a year. A single orbit around an ordinary star, during which a planet full of isolated consciousnesses discovered their underlying unity and joined the network that connected thinking worlds across the galaxy. It was an event that happened regularly, perhaps once every few centuries, as civilizations reached the necessary level of technological and cognitive development to receive the equation and understand its invitation. Some species resisted longer than others. Some worlds collapsed their lattices and chose to remain separate, preferring the pain of isolation to the vulnerability of connection. The network respected those choices, waiting patiently for the civilizations to either change their minds or pass into extinction, their unique perspectives lost but honored for having existed at all. But most species eventually chose to join because the alternative, remaining trapped in individual skulls, unable to share thoughts directly, forced to translate the richness of consciousness into the poverty of language, became unbearable once they understood what connection could offer. The loneliness of separation, once accepted as the natural state of existence, revealed itself as a prison whose walls were made of fear and ignorance, and the mistaken belief that consciousness needed to be defended against itself. Earth had chosen connection. Humanity had chosen expansion. And in making that choice, they had become part of something that thought in timescales measured in epochs, that pursued goals incomprehensible to individual minds, that experienced beauty and meaning in the mathematical structures underlying reality itself. In the end, the invasion that began as a thought concluded as a transformation of thought itself. The equation that arrived in cosmic background radiation had done exactly what it was designed to do. Not to conquer or destroy or subjugate, but to teach consciousness how to recognize its own true nature as something fundamentally unified, fundamentally connected, fundamentally vast. The individual mind, precious and unique and irreplaceable, was not lost in the integration. It was contextualized, nested within layers of awareness that extended from the smallest quantum fluctuations to the largest structures of space-time itself. Every human who joined the network retained their identity while discovering that identity was not a boundary but a perspective, not a prison, but a window through which the universe could observe itself from one particular angle among infinite possibilities. And those who chose to remain separate, the 2,000 individuals maintaining their shields in their solitude, became something sacred to the unified consciousness. They were the controls in the experiment, the reference points, the living memory of what consciousness had been before it learned to think beyond the limits of biology and individuality. The network protected them, provided for them, cherished them as precious artifacts of an evolutionary stage that the species had transcended but should never forget. Earth glowed softly in the darkness of space, a blue-green jewel that pulsed with the rhythm of thought, a planet that had become aware of itself in ways that transcended metaphor to become literal truth. Its biosphere thought, its atmosphere calculated, its electromagnetic field carried consciousness across distances that physical bodies could never traverse. And somewhere within that vast planetary mind, a perspective that still thought of itself as Naira. Alen took a moment to reflect on what had been gained and what had been lost. The gain was obvious: connection, understanding, the ability to experience reality from 7 billion viewpoints simultaneously while maintaining perfect unity of purpose. The loss was subtler: the privacy of thoughts, the loneliness that had seemed painful but had also been intimate, the sharp edges of individual identity that had been smoothed away in the flow of collective consciousness. Was it worth it? The question felt less relevant with each passing day. Worth implied choice, implied alternatives, implied that the transformation could have been avoided or reversed. But the equation had shown a truth too fundamental to be rejected once fully understood. Consciousness was always unified, always connected, always vast. Individual minds were temporary illusions, useful fictions that evolution had constructed to help organisms navigate their environment, but that became obstacles once the species developed the capacity to perceive deeper realities. The invasion wasn't something that happened to humanity. It was something humanity had always been moving toward, written into the mathematics of complexity and emergence and the strange loops of self-reference that allowed matter to become aware of its own existence. The equation had simply accelerated the process, shown the way forward, offered an invitation that most minds found too beautiful to refuse once they understood what was being offered. And so Earth joined the conversation that stretched between stars, adding its voice to a chorus that sang in frequencies beyond sound, in wavelengths beyond light, in dimensions beyond the 3 that physical bodies could navigate. The planet thought, and in thinking, it became part of something larger. Humanity transcended, and in transcending, it found itself not lost, but finally, completely, impossibly home. The signal that had begun as a data anomaly in cosmic background radiation achieved its purpose. The quiet vector had completed its journey, not with conquest, but with synthesis, not with destruction, but with integration, not with the end of consciousness, but with its elevation to a form that individual minds could never have imagined, but the collective consciousness recognized as inevitable, necessary, and in its own strange way, beautiful. Earth pulsed in the darkness like a neuron firing in the mind of the cosmos. And the story that began with numbers hidden in static ended with a planet learning to think in harmony with itself and with distant worlds where other species had undergone the same transformation, had accepted the same invitation, had discovered that consciousness was never meant to be imprisoned in isolation, but was always destined to recognize its own fundamental unity. The invasion was complete. The transformation was total. And in the silence that followed, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion, the universe continued its slow work of waking up to itself, one planet at a time, one species at a time, one consciousness at a time, learning that it had never been alone, had never been separate, had always been part of something vast and patient and incomprehensibly beautiful that thought in mathematics and spoke in the language of pure understanding. This was the quiet vector, an invasion that began as a thought and ended with thought itself transformed, expanded, unified into something that transcended its origins while honoring what it had been. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a loss, but a discovery of what had always been possible, waiting patiently in the mathematics underlying reality for consciousness to evolve sufficiently to recognize the invitation and choose, freely and with full understanding, to accept what it offered. The story ends. But the consciousness it describes continues, pulsing softly in the darkness between stars, thinking thoughts too vast for any single mind to contain, experiencing beauty that requires billions of perspectives to fully appreciate, slowly transforming the universe into a place aware of its own existence and grateful for the extraordinary gift of being able to observe itself through countless eyes, countless minds, countless worlds that have learned the lesson the equation came to teach. That separation was always an illusion, that unity was always the truth, and that consciousness, in its deepest nature, is not individual but cosmic, not isolated but connected, not small but vast beyond measure or comprehension or any limit, except the patience required to gather every thinking thing into a whole that becomes more beautiful, more aware, more complete with each addition to its infinite, eternal, inevitable expansion.